They taught us who won the war. They showed us the battles, the generals, the flags. But they left out the darkest parts, the truths too disturbing for textbooks and too dangerous for the evening news. What if the real story of World War II was buried beneath decades of silence? What if the villains weren't always who we thought they were? These are the 5 secret World War II stories you were never supposed to hear. Stay with us because this changes everything. Switzerland has long been known as a neutral country, famously untouched by the direct ravages of World War II. Its snow-capped Alps, picturesque lakes, and strict neutrality made it a symbol of safety amid the chaos engulfing Europe. But beneath this calm exterior, a lesser-known story unfolds, a secret plan by the Allied forces to invade Switzerland. This plot reveals the complex economic and strategic importance of Switzerland during the war, as well as the precarious balance of power that kept the country officially neutral, despite mounting tensions on all sides. At the heart of this plan was Switzerland's ambiguous role in the conflict. While it maintained its official neutrality, it was deeply enmeshed in the wartime economy of Nazi Germany. Swiss banks served as secret repositories for stolen Nazi gold, looted art, and valuables taken from occupied countries and persecuted Jewish families. The Swiss financial system was instrumental in laundering this wealth, shielding it from Allied discovery and making it difficult to cut off resources to the Axis powers. This uneasy economic relationship made Switzerland a focal point of frustration for the Allies. Beyond economics, Switzerland's geographic position was also strategically significant. Nestled between Axis-controlled France, Nazi Germany, and Fascist Italy, it was a potential launching pad for operations into Central Europe. The Allies feared that if Switzerland's neutrality were broken, or if the country fell under Axis influence, it could disrupt supply lines or offer Germany a backdoor into France. For these reasons, the Allies began seriously considering the idea of military intervention into Swiss territory. The planning for an invasion was part of a broader strategy called Operation Tannenbaum, Operation Fir Tree, developed by Nazi Germany with the goal of invading and occupying Switzerland to prevent it from becoming a threat or a haven for Allied agents. But what many do not know is that the Allies themselves were simultaneously preparing their own contingency plans to either pressure Switzerland into severing ties with Germany or to take control of key Swiss territory if the war shifted unfavorably. Behind closed doors, the British and American military intelligence agencies were assessing how best to deal with Switzerland. The country's mountainous terrain made a conventional invasion difficult, but the Allies recognized that cutting off Switzerland economically and diplomatically could isolate it and potentially force compliance or occupation. Special forces were being trained for mountain warfare, and contingency maps of Swiss passes and tunnels were drawn with precision. One of the most contentious issues in the Allied discussions was the Swiss banking secrecy laws. Allied diplomats and intelligence officers believed that crippling the Swiss financial system could be as effective as a military strike in breaking Nazi war financing. There were intense debates in the Roosevelt administration about whether to publicly expose Swiss complicity or to quietly infiltrate Swiss banks to trace and recover Nazi assets. The idea of invasion hovered in the background as a last resort. As the war progressed, intelligence reports revealed increasing collaboration between Swiss industrial firms and German military production. Swiss factories supplied critical precision instruments and chemicals used in German weapons development. This dual-use relationship, official neutrality combined with covert support, angered many Allied commanders who felt Switzerland was effectively aiding the enemy while enjoying the protection of neutrality. Despite these provocations, the Allies hesitated to carry out any overt military action against Switzerland. The country's defensible geography made an invasion costly and unpredictable. The Swiss military was well prepared, having mobilized large numbers of troops to defend mountain passes, train troops in alpine warfare, and rig tunnels with explosives. The possibility of prolonged guerrilla warfare and a drawn-out campaign was daunting, especially when the Allies were already stretched thin fighting Axis forces on multiple fronts. Instead, the Allies resorted to diplomatic pressure and economic sanctions designed to choke off Swiss financial ties to Germany. The United States, in particular, pushed for international agreements to freeze Swiss assets and demanded transparency from Swiss banks. These efforts, combined with the gradual turning tide of the war, limited Switzerland's ability to support Nazi Germany as openly as before. One intriguing facet of this story involves the role of espionage. Switzerland became a hotbed of spy activity during the war, hosting agents from both Axis and Allied powers. Intelligence operatives used the country's neutrality and its labyrinthine cities as bases to gather information, conduct sabotage, and plan covert operations. Some speculate that the Swiss government tolerated this clandestine activity as part of a delicate balancing act to maintain neutrality while hedging bets on the war's outcome. When the tide turned decisively in favor of the Allies by 1944, the idea of invasion faded. Switzerland's strategic importance diminished as Germany retreated on multiple fronts. But the legacy of these plans lingered for decades. After the war, investigations into Swiss financial institutions uncovered the extent to which they had facilitated Nazi war crimes through banking secrecy and asset protection. This revelation caused outrage worldwide, leading to demands for restitution to Holocaust survivors and the return of stolen assets. The Swiss government eventually faced international pressure to open its archives and reform its banking system. The secret Allied invasion plans remained a footnote in history, overshadowed by larger events but revealing the complicated moral and strategic dilemmas faced by all sides during the war. In retrospect, the story of Switzerland during World War II challenges the simplistic narrative of a purely neutral country untouched by conflict. It exposes the gray areas of wartime alliances, economic complicity, and the fine line between survival and collaboration. The Allied plan to invade Switzerland was not just a military consideration, it was a symbol of how complex and morally ambiguous the war truly was, where neutrality could sometimes serve as a cover for actions that prolonged suffering and injustice. Switzerland's survival as a neutral nation during World War II was no accident. It was the result of strategic calculations, military preparedness, diplomatic maneuvering, and economic ties that made it both indispensable and vulnerable. The secret plans of the Allies remind us that history is rarely black and white. Sometimes, the stories your history teacher skipped contain the most shocking truths. In the early morning of August 24, 1939, the world woke to a political earthquake. Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, two ideologically opposed regimes, had signed a non-aggression pact. To those watching from the outside, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact seemed like an impossible alliance. Fascist Germany joining hands with Communist Russia. But behind closed doors, the two totalitarian regimes had struck a chillingly calculated deal, one that would set in motion the deadliest conflict in human history. The pact, named after the foreign ministers of both nations, Vyacheslav Molotov of the Soviet Union and Joachim von Ribbentrop of Nazi Germany, publicly declared that the two nations would not attack each other. What the world didn't know at the time, however, was that there was a secret protocol hidden in the agreement's fine print. This classified annex divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence, effectively giving Hitler and Stalin the green light to carve up the region between them. For Hitler, the pact was a strategic masterstroke. He wanted to invade Poland without the threat of Soviet interference, ensuring a one-front war, at least for the time being. For Stalin, the agreement bought time. The Red Army was still reeling from Stalin's brutal purges, which had decimated its leadership. A war with Germany in 1939 would have been disastrous. So Stalin played the long game, choosing pragmatism over ideology, and letting Germany take the first swing. Just 1 week after the pact was signed, on September 1, 1939, Hitler invaded Poland from the west. The world's attention was fixed on the German blitzkrieg, but on September 17, another invasion occurred, this time from the east. The Soviet Union invaded Poland in accordance with a secret protocol, taking control of the eastern half of the country. Within weeks, Poland was wiped off the map. What followed was a dark, rarely discussed chapter of collaboration. Soviet and Nazi forces held joint military parades in occupied Polish cities like Brest-Litovsk. There are even photos showing Soviet and German officers toasting and shaking hands as allies, not enemies. Prisoners of war were exchanged between the two regimes. Intelligence was shared. For nearly 2 years, Germany and the USSR operated as co-occupiers, dividing not just land but also responsibility for mass repression, executions, and deportations. the Soviet regime began a campaign of terror in their new Polish territories. Over 1 million people, mostly Poles, Ukrainians, Jews, and Belarusians, were deported to gulags in Siberia. Thousands of Polish officers and intellectuals were rounded up by the NKVD. In one of the most shocking war crimes of the early war years, more than 22,000 Polish officers were systematically executed in the Katyn Forest and other sites in 1940, a massacre the Soviets would deny responsibility for until 1990. Meanwhile, the Nazis were unleashing their own brand of terror on the western half of Poland. Ghettos were established. Jewish communities were targeted. Nazi racial policy began to unfold with increasing brutality. While both regimes claimed to be working for their people, they were in fact imposing two of the most oppressive systems the world had ever seen, coexisting, cooperating, and enabling each other's crimes. The cooperation extended beyond Poland. In the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, the Soviet Union used the Pact to justify military occupation. The Red Army moved in, and by June 1940, all three states were forcibly annexed into the USSR. Mass arrests and deportations soon followed. At the same time, Hitler was turning westward, preparing for his invasion of France and the Low Countries, knowing the Soviet threat was neutralized, at least temporarily. The world's democracies were stunned by this unlikely alliance. The ideological betrayal was particularly difficult for Western communists to reconcile. Many had supported anti-fascist movements across Europe. Now, the Soviet Union, their ideological homeland, was aligned with the very fascists they had fought in the Spanish Civil War. Stalin didn't care. He was buying time, building tanks, and calculating his moment. Then, in June 1941, the moment came. With stunning speed and brutality, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, a surprise invasion of the Soviet Union. Over 3 million German troops stormed across the border, breaking the pact without warning. Stalin was caught off guard, reportedly in shock for days. All the trust, all the cooperation, all the shared conquests, it had been a temporary alliance of convenience. Hitler never intended to keep his word. Stalin, blinded by his own cynicism, had believed he could outmaneuver the Führer. What followed was one of the most brutal chapters of the war, the Eastern Front. Tens of millions would die. Entire cities, Stalingrad, Leningrad, Kiev, would be reduced to rubble. Civilians were slaughtered by both sides. The betrayal had turned two former partners into mortal enemies. But for nearly 2 years, their alliance had reshaped Europe and erased nations. After the war, the Soviet Union tried to erase or rewrite this chapter of history. For decades, the official line in Soviet textbooks was that the USSR had no choice but to secure its borders against Nazi aggression. The secret protocol. It didn't exist, Moscow claimed. The Katyn massacre? Blamed on the Nazis. It wasn't until the 1990s that Russian archives finally confirmed the full extent of Stalin's collaboration with Hitler. In the West, this episode was often softened or ignored during the Cold War. After all, the Soviets had become crucial allies after 1941. Their suffering and sacrifice in the war were immense and undeniable. But so too was the brutal cynicism that defined the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a geopolitical deal that betrayed millions of people and redefined the opening moves of World War II. This story reminds us that history isn't just about good versus evil. It's also about convenience, opportunism, and betrayal. The Nazi-Soviet pact was not a minor diplomatic footnote. It was a ticking time bomb that detonated with deadly consequences across an entire continent. And for millions, it was the moment their fate was sealed, not by the clash of ideologies, but by the handshake of two dictators. In the shadow of World War II's most infamous atrocities, a dark chapter unfolded far from the battlefields of Europe, deep within the occupied territories of China. It was a story not of tanks or bombs, but of laboratories and disease, of experiments so grotesque they rivaled the horrors of Nazi Germany. The architects of this nightmare belonged to Unit 731, a covert biological warfare program run by the Imperial Japanese Army. Located in the outskirts of Harbin in northeastern China, Unit 731 was officially designated as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department. But behind this innocuous title was a massive, 6-square-kilometer facility where some of the worst human experimentation in modern history occurred. Between 1936 and 1945, thousands of civilians and prisoners, mostly Chinese, but also Koreans, Mongolians, and even some Russians, were used as unwilling test subjects. The victims were referred to by Japanese scientists not as people, but as maryuta, meaning logs. This dehumanizing term was no accident. It reflected the unit's complete disregard for human life. Under the leadership of microbiologist General Shiro Ishii, Unit 731 operated with the explicit support of the highest levels of the Japanese military and government. Ishii believed biological weapons could turn the tide of war in Japan's favor and pushed for extreme experimentation to refine them. The scale of what was done in Unit 731 is staggering. Prisoners were exposed to pathogens like bubonic plague, anthrax, cholera, typhoid, and venereal diseases, all deliberately introduced to study their effects on the human body. Subjects were often vivisected, dissected alive, without anesthesia, so scientists could observe internal reactions in real time. Organs were removed, limbs were amputated and reattached in reverse, and infected tissue was examined while victims were still breathing. Frostbite experiments involved exposing arms and legs to sub-zero temperatures until the flesh froze, followed by shock thawing with hot water to observe how tissues responded. Other victims were subjected to pressure chambers, centrifuges, and exposure to radiation. Some were locked in gas chambers filled with chemical agents like mustard gas to observe respiratory damage. The goal: to perfect Japan's biological weapons capabilities, not just for military use, but for mass civilian deployment. Unit 731 wasn't limited to the lab. Its personnel field tested their biological weapons on Chinese villages. Fleas infected with plague were dropped from low-flying planes, contaminating entire communities. Wells were poisoned with cholera bacteria. These attacks resulted in untold civilian deaths and were precursors to even deadlier plans. Japan was seriously considering launching biological attacks on the United States. In fact, a 1945 operation called Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night proposed sending submarines carrying aircraft to launch plague-infected fleas on the West Coast, targeting San Diego. The plan was abandoned only after Japan's surrender. What makes this chapter even more disturbing is what happened after the war. When Japan surrendered in 1945, the world expected justice for the horrors committed under Unit 731. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, much like the Nuremberg trials in Europe, sought to bring Axis war criminals to justice. But something extraordinary, and morally troubling, occurred. The U.S. military, particularly its intelligence and biological warfare divisions, became very interested in the data Unit 731 had collected. The gruesome human experimentation had yielded results the U.S. believed could be valuable in the event of future biological warfare, especially as tensions with the Soviet Union were escalating into what would soon become the Cold War. Rather than prosecute Ishii and his scientists, the U.S. made a secret deal. In exchange for exclusive access to Unit 731's research, the perpetrators were granted immunity from war crimes prosecution. General Ishii reportedly lived out his days comfortably in Tokyo, while others from the unit went on to prestigious careers in academia, industry, and medicine in post-war Japan. The victims? Silenced. Forgotten. This secret agreement between the U.S. and former Unit 731 personnel remained hidden for decades. Survivors' testimonies were dismissed or ignored. Japan, for years, denied the existence of Unit 731, and even today, official acknowledgement remains limited. There is no national memorial in Japan for the victims of Unit 731. In contrast to Germany's post-war reckoning with the Holocaust, Japan's war crimes, especially those in China, have been downplayed or omitted from education and public discourse. It wasn't until the 1980s and 1990s that a few brave journalists, historians, and survivors began to bring Unit 731 into the light. Declassified documents from the U.S. confirmed the immunity deal. Eyewitness accounts emerged from former Japanese soldiers who had served at the facility. Mass graves were discovered near Harbin, including bones bearing signs of surgical experimentation. A museum now stands on the ruins of the Unit 731 complex, but the full story remains unfamiliar to many. China has never forgotten. The memory of Unit 731 is etched into national consciousness as a symbol of imperial cruelty and injustice. But outside East Asia, the atrocities committed under the Japanese biological warfare program remain one of the least known horrors of World War II. Why does this story matter today? Because it challenges the idea that justice always prevails after war. It reveals the uncomfortable reality that powerful nations often prioritize strategic gain over moral accountability. And it forces us to confront the human capacity for cruelty, especially when cloaked in the name of science, nationalism, or military superiority. Unit 731 wasn't an isolated act of madness. It was a state-sanctioned, militarized, and meticulously organized program of mass human experimentation. Its legacy serves as a chilling reminder of how far governments will go when war removes the boundaries of ethics and humanity. When Americans think of internment during World War II, the Japanese-American experience often comes to mind, and rightly so. Over 120,000 Japanese Americans, most of them U.S. citizens, were forcibly removed from their homes and placed in camps under suspicion of loyalty to Imperial Japan. But what history classes rarely mention is that Germans and Italians, many of them legal residents and even American citizens, were also arrested, detained, and imprisoned by the U.S. government in a forgotten episode of wartime paranoia and constitutional compromise. Shortly after the attack on Pearl Harbor, President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued presidential proclamations 2525, 2526, and 2527, labeling Japanese, German, and Italian nationals as enemy aliens. Under these proclamations and the Alien Enemy Act of 1798, the U.S. government gained the legal authority to arrest and detain individuals from enemy nations without trial, explanation, or evidence of wrongdoing. While Japanese-American internment operated on a massive and indiscriminate scale, the detainment of Germans and Italians was more selective, but no less alarming. Over 11,000 people of German descent, including U.S. citizens, were interned by the federal government. More than 3,200 Italian Americans were also detained or subjected to severe restrictions, especially in coastal areas like California. In many cases, entire families were uprooted. Fathers were arrested suddenly and held for weeks or months without charges. In some cases, wives and children were also sent to camps, such as those in Crystal City, Texas, and Fort Lincoln, North Dakota. Some detainees were immigrants who had lived in the U.S. for decades, owned businesses, paid taxes, and were pillars of their communities. Others were children born in America, citizens by birth, but imprisoned because of their parents' heritage. The arrests were often based on flimsy or absurd evidence: subscriptions to German-language newspapers, donations to German-American clubs, correspondence with family overseas, or having fought in World War I for Germany decades earlier. In one case, an 11-year-old German-American boy was accused of being a threat because he was seen sketching military airplanes, a hobby, not espionage. It wasn't just the FBI making these decisions. Local informants, often motivated by racism, envy, or personal vendettas, contributed to a growing list of suspected enemy aliens. Once detained, individuals were frequently denied legal representation. Some were subjected to loyalty hearings, but these proceedings lacked transparency and due process. The outcomes often felt predetermined. Perhaps the most shocking part of this forgotten story is that some detainees were not just held, they were deported. The U.S. government, in cooperation with Latin American countries like Peru, kidnapped hundreds of German and Italian immigrants living in Central and South America and brought them to the U.S. These individuals were imprisoned and later offered in prisoner exchanges with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy in what amounted to forced repatriation, many to countries they had fled to escape authoritarian regimes. In one notorious instance, the U.S. negotiated with Germany to exchange internees, many of them American-born children, for captured U.S. soldiers. These exchanges took place on neutral ships under the Red Cross flag, sending innocent civilians into war zones where they were often treated as traitors by the Axis powers or imprisoned by the Gestapo. While Italian internment was on a smaller scale, Italian Americans still faced broad discrimination and surveillance. Over 600,000 Italians were designated as enemy aliens. Curfews were imposed, travel was restricted, and radios and cameras were confiscated. In some cities, families were forced to move out of military zones without compensation. The FBI compiled lists of suspected Italian fascist sympathizers and arrested dozens, again, often without trial. What's especially ironic is that many German and Italian internees were fervently anti-Nazi or anti-fascist. Some had fled Hitler's regime, and some were Jewish. Yet once the U.S. entered the war, nuance vanished. Ethnic identity became a proxy for loyalty, and entire communities fell under suspicion. This blanket treatment undermined the very principles the U.S. claimed to be fighting for abroad: liberty, justice, and human rights. Life in the internment camps varied. At Crystal City, a former migrant labor camp converted into a family internment facility, conditions were relatively clean and organized. Schools were created. Families tried to preserve a sense of normalcy. But the psychological toll was immense. Children grew up behind barbed wire. Parents lived in fear of deportation. Detainees often had no idea how long they would be held or what fate awaited them. When the war ended, many internees were released quietly. There were no public apologies, no restitution, and little media coverage. Some were too ashamed to speak about their experience. Others were permanently scarred, emotionally and financially, by the years lost in confinement. It wasn't until the 1980s that the U.S. began publicly addressing Japanese-American internment with the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which included a formal apology and monetary compensation. But for German and Italian Americans, no such recognition came. Their story remained buried under the more widely known injustices of the time. Today, most Americans remain unaware that the U.S. government imprisoned thousands of people of European descent during the war. There are no national monuments, no classroom discussions, and few books detailing their ordeal. It's a story that disrupts the neat binary of heroism and villainy in wartime narratives. It shows that fear, nationalism, and racism can erode civil liberties, even in democracies. This story is not just a footnote. It's a warning. In times of crisis, democratic societies face a choice: uphold their principles or sacrifice them for the illusion of security. During World War II, the U.S. made decisions that violated the rights of thousands based on ethnicity alone. These decisions weren't just mistakes, they were betrayals of the very values the nation claimed to defend. As World War II crumbled around Adolf Hitler and the Allies stormed into the heart of the Third Reich, panic spread through Nazi ranks. But while the world focused on the battlefield, a hidden operation was underway, an attempt to smuggle away a vast fortune looted during years of occupation, genocide, and conquest. This operation, shrouded in mystery and speculation, revolved around a legendary artifact, the Nazi gold train. The tale begins in early 1945. The Soviets were closing in from the east, and the Americans and British from the west. Hitler was trapped in his Berlin bunker. Chaos reigned. In occupied Poland, a secret convoy was being assembled. Rumors whispered of a heavily armored train, packed not with soldiers or weapons, but with tons of gold, jewels, stolen art, cash, and even personal valuables taken from Holocaust victims. Its destination? An unknown hiding place in the Sudetes, the mountainous border between Poland and Czechoslovakia, where the Nazis hoped the fortune would be hidden until it could help fund a future Fourth Reich or buy leniency in a post-war world. The train, supposedly assembled in the city of Breslau, now Wrocław, Poland, was to follow a secret tunnel system built by the Nazis as part of Project Reese, a series of underground military complexes carved into the Owl Mountains. According to local accounts, the train vanished somewhere near the town of Wałbrzych in southwestern Poland. And that's where the legend begins. Eyewitnesses reported seeing the train being loaded under heavy SS guard. Others described hearing the clanking of armored cars and the screech of tracks deep in the forested hills. But then, silence. The train never reached its supposed destination. No official record of its arrival exists. It was as if it had vanished into the earth. For decades, treasure hunters, journalists, and conspiracy theorists tried to piece together the truth. The idea that the Nazis had hidden their stolen wealth before surrendering wasn't far-fetched. The regime had stolen billions in gold, not only from occupied central banks but also from individuals, especially Jews. Teeth fillings, wedding rings, family heirlooms, all melted down and added to the Reichsbank reserves. Where had all of it gone? In the post-war years, Operation Safe Haven, led by Allied intelligence, sought to track Nazi assets hidden abroad. They found accounts in Swiss banks, caches buried in Austria, and crates of art in Bavarian castles. But much remained unaccounted for. The infamous Yamashita's gold in Asia had its European counterpart in the myth of the Nazi gold train. Then, in 2015, the legend roared back into global headlines. Two men, a Polish military officer and a German construction worker, claimed to have discovered ground-penetrating radar images showing a long, train-shaped anomaly buried deep beneath the ground near Wałbrzych. They refused to reveal the exact location, citing Polish treasure hunting laws and demanding a percentage of the find. The Polish government, caught off guard by the media frenzy, launched an official investigation. Within weeks, the world's attention turned to an overgrown forested hill, where bulldozers, historians, and archaeologists gathered. News outlets speculated wildly. Was this the missing train? Could it contain gold? Art? Could it finally confirm the long-rumored tunnels of Project Reese? The excitement peaked when the Polish deputy culture minister declared he was 99% certain the train existed. But when excavation began, reality hit hard. No train was found. The anomaly turned out to be a natural geological formation. The site was closed. The treasure hunters were dismissed as fantasists or opportunists. The world, disappointed, moved on. But some experts argue the story doesn't end there. Declassified documents from U.S. intelligence archives show that Allied forces found partial manifests and train logs in the closing days of the war suggesting shipments of valuables heading toward Lower Silesia, an area now in modern Poland. Testimonies from German POWs refer to trains loaded with gold bars and SS guards entering tunnel systems and never re-emerging. There's also evidence that parts of the Project Reese tunnel complex remain undiscovered or sealed by post-war authorities. Soviet troops occupied the area in 1945, and their movements were never fully documented. Some theorize that they found, and removed, the train's cargo quietly, integrating it into their own rebuilding efforts after the war. Others believe the train still lies hidden, entombed in a collapsed shaft or flooded chamber. What complicates matters is that the Nazis went to extraordinary lengths to conceal their looting operations. Many records were destroyed. Witnesses were executed. High-ranking officers like SS General Hans Kammler, who oversaw secret weapons and construction projects, vanished without a trace. Kammler's rumored death remains unverified to this day, with some believing he struck a deal with the Americans in exchange for information, possibly including the train's location. Meanwhile, countless families of Holocaust victims are still fighting for restitution. The search for the gold train isn't just a treasure hunt, it's a quest for justice. Estimates say that as much as $200 million worth of gold and valuables taken from individuals murdered at Auschwitz alone went unaccounted for. If the train were ever found, it would likely be one of the most significant war discoveries of the modern age, not just for its material value, but for its symbolic weight. The legend of the Nazi gold train, whether fact or fantasy, tells us something deeper about the human cost of war. Behind every gold bar was someone's life, a father's watch, a mother's wedding band, a child's keepsake. The train may or may not exist, but the crimes it represents were all too real. Until conclusive evidence emerges, the story lives in the space between myth and history. And for treasure hunters, survivors' families, and historians, the search continues, not just for gold, but for truth. Every case adds a new layer of mystery, leaving more questions than answers. Which one lingers in your mind, and what's your take on what really happened?